Hi, and welcome to Police Stories Podcast. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force across 3 different forces, or services as they now like to be called. Everything seems to change its name for the sake of it every now and then, particularly in the police. The units regularly got renamed for the sake of it, and then there's all the expense of the paperwork changing, etc. Seems ridiculous, but no doubt somebody got a promotion off the back of that name change for whatever reason, but I'm immediately ranting and I apologise. Sorry. So, yes, this is episode 58 and, a series of short stories about my career, and we've been talking a lot about diving, etc. Firstly, thank you for the downloads this week. Been very good. By the time you hear this, we'll be over 12,000 downloads in total, so that's amazing. Thank you. And again, the Buy Me a Coffee has been really good this week, so thanks for that. YouTube as well, don't forget you can go on there and add a comment, ask a question, etc. So that's good. But this week we're back to the diving. We had something slightly different last week, but we're back to the diving this week, and a story that I hope you'll find interesting. So we talked before about, we didn't just do on the Marine Unit or the Underwater and Confined Spaces Search Team in the Met, we didn't just do work for the Met. Most of our work was within the London area because it's such a busy place. It's not like you needed to go elsewhere looking for work. Invariably, we had 2 or 3 jobs on the go at once and would have to try and rotate round them, and keep all the bosses happy, they were all getting their money's worth out of us effectively. But on sometimes we also got mutual aid requests. Now, this is a nationally set up system throughout all police forces, and any force can basically request mutual aid to this central unit that coordinates all this stuff, and then they decide where the resources are coming from. Now, the usual thing when you're talking about big things are COP26 in Glasgow, for example. They had a lot of mutual aid up because it's a huge commitment. I think when you had one of the G8s or one of the whatever we're up to now, which is a sort of convention for heads of state from around the world. I think the last one was down in Cornwall, and again, Devon and Cornwall is not a massive force. There's no way they could cope with that influx of security and just the sheer size of it by themselves. So they put in a mutual aid request, and again, you had people there from the Met, from Scotland, from all over really in different departments. But it can be on a much lesser scale as well. Very few forces now in the UK have dive teams anymore because they're very expensive to run. The training is expensive, the equipment is expensive, the servicing of the equipment, basically everything about it is expensive. So a lot of forces over the years have slowly done away with their dive teams. So now, you're much less divers available than you were. But at the end of the day, if you believe, if you work in a certain force, rural force, one of the smaller forces who doesn't have a dive team, and you believe you have a body in the water, there isn't really any other options for recovering it. So you either wait it out and hope that he or she will eventually float up, which they will do to start with, although if you miss the opportunity of finding them, once they sink for a second time, they're gone forever. So that's not really ideal, especially when you've got perhaps a high profile case and you've got family that are waiting, etc. To say we're just sort of sitting back and twiddling our thumbs waiting, isn't really going to cut it. Now, there is 1 or 2 civilian contractors in the country as well, and they'll get involved too for a price. And in fact, one of them particularly works with a lot of forces and featured heavily in the Nicola Bulley case, which was a missing person. They got involved in that. Forces, as I say, haven't got a lot of choice, but on this job we're going to talk about today, I think it was Hertfordshire that put the request in, which isn't a million miles away, depending on what part. It's sort of 2 or 3 hour drive from London. They put in a request that they had a misper they'd like us to go and search a river for. So, as I say, normally we would try and work that so that we could, we could achieve that. And we travelled up during the day to this area. We were met at the local police station by the SIO, the Senior Investigating Officer, and really by the time, or in terms of calling us, we would ask them to have just made sure that they had absolutely ruled out every other possibility. It was difficult for us to get up, and resource-wise was difficult to achieve. So we would just ask that they had done everything they could prior to us getting there. And that's exactly what they'd done. They'd done a lot of what we call cell site analysis, which is in relation to mobile phones. You can track where somebody was if you have their number. You can bounce their signal off of the local cell site towers, the aerials, the mobile phone masts, and you can start triangulating down to an area fairly small. And also, you're able to tell, or not me personally, because I'm not techie, but techie types within the police can tell you how the phone was turned off as well. So if it was powered down, i.e. the power button pressed, they can tell you that. If someone took the battery out, they can tell you that. But more importantly, from my point of view, they can tell you if the phone died because of water ingress. Now, don't ask me how, but several times we did jobs and they were able to say, yes, this phone definitely died when it went into water. Now, it doesn't 100%, give you the clue as to what happened to them, because obviously, the phone could have been thrown into somewhere completely different, that was a pond or whatever. But it does give you a pretty good steer if everything is leading you to, this pond, lake, stream, river, whatever it is. So the mutual aid request came in. We travelled up to Hertfordshire in our truck, and we're met by the local guy, and he took us down to the location. And now this guy, the backstory was he was about 70, I think, from what I remember, and his wife of many years, I think 50 plus years, had died of cancer, and basically his son and daughter had said, he was absolutely destroyed by this. I mean, it's a very tough situation, anyone will know, I'm sure. And he basically had given up on life. He just didn't want to be here anymore, and he'd sort of made it clear, and he'd had a couple of phone calls and texts to his son and daughter, sort of stating what he was intending to do, not where, because he didn't want to be stopped. And then he went off the grid, and they hadn't seen him for, it was 3 days, and he was eventually reported missing. All the inquiries were done, but everything led them to this stream. River more like. It was about 10 to 15 metres wide, not that deep, about 3 metres. And if you had to think of a sort of quintessential English summer scene, to paint, that was it. It was it was running through fields. It had kind of, cows on both sides. There was weeping willows, dangling in the water. And any other time it would have been a great place, for a picnic or something. It was a really lovely scene. But unfortunately we were there for a very different reason. And when we got to the location, obviously what really made them think he was in there was there was a very neatly folded pile of clothes next to the river. It was quite steep sides, and there was one place that was, if you had to climb into the river, this would be the place you'd do it. And just by that spot was these clothes. Now, from memory again, there was a jacket, a t-shirt, shoes and socks. There was no trousers. That was the one slightly unusual thing. No trousers at all. And unfortunately, we came to find out why, as we'll discuss in a minute. But and you might be thinking that's unusual, but I've seen that several times where people, and I always thought it was a strange one. They're in this mindset that they're basically going to end their own life. So they must be in a bad place. Yet some of them, take the time to neatly fold clothes and put them to one side. And there was things like his passport was on top of his clothes, so he really wanted to make sure that, he was identified and quickly, And so he had thought about these things. So it's not like he was completely, a gibbering wreck. He was clearly thinking quite sort of straightforward about some practical things, which is, it's impossible to get your head around it really. But I was the diver on this occasion. We talked about the number rotation. I was diver number 6, and I was the next diver, so I was first in. Now, you assume that he's going to be near these clothes, but you don't know. So once again, I think we came back about 20 metres to one side of where the clothes were. And it was a little bit of an awkward search because we did an arc search, and we've discussed that in previous chapters about what that looks like and how that sort of works on the ground. But The attendant stood right on the edge of the river, and then when I went in, I went at quite an oblique angle, at least 45 degrees away from the attendant, towards the area that we found the clothes in. And then I was stopped, roughly 20 metres short of the actual, where the clothes were, where we expected to find him. And you'd be surprised, even in areas that have tide, if someone tells us, or if we know a body's gone in or somebody's gone in at a certain point, we very often find them at exactly that point. To start with, they really don't move much at all. Now, if you have very strong tides, it would be different. But on a number of occasions, we went into an area where we believed there to be someone, and that's where we found them. That always surprised me. You have these visions of bodies floating off and that, but when people first go in, they don't float. They sink, and they tend to stay where they are unless there's quite substantial tides. So as soon as I hit the bottom, firstly, I thought it was going to be quite a pleasant dive if you take away what I was there for, because there was a bit of visibility. I could see about a metre, which was a real luxury for us. And it was a gravel bottom, which generally meant it was quite clean, and there was just a little bit of river flow. Now, what that means is that when you're on the bottom sort of grubbing around and you're kicking up silt and stuff, that flow just takes away that bit of silt you're kicking up, so it's continually sort of clearing the water. So it actually stayed with visibility. And initially, for the first probably only about 5 metres or so, it was a really nice dive, and I was thinking, I'm actually quite enjoying this, and this is, this should be pretty straightforward, because there was nothing on the bottom. It was a completely clear bottom. So he was going to stand out very easily. Unfortunately, within about 5 metres, of course, it went downhill significantly. The visibility stayed the same, but what happened was some of those overhanging trees we've been talking about had been cut by, I don't know, the farmer, whoever. Perhaps they'd caused a blockage or an issue and they decided to cut them, but they'd just been left in the river. So unfortunately, I could see it as I was approaching it. There was a number of trees, 3 or 4 very large trees that were now on the bottom of the river. And, it's not just the big tree trunks that are there, it's everything that goes with them. So off of every, tree trunk, there is big branches, small branches, leaves. It was a total mess underwater. And don't forget, I've said that divers always have a line attached to them one way or another, whether you're on scuba or surface supply. And I just knew this was going to be an issue. So I came up and actually told them on the comms what the problem was going to be, and that the attendant would have to keep an eye on me, because in the water it's very difficult. You do get disorientated. It's very difficult to realise if you've got a snag, and you can find yourself doing a series of sort of mini arcs in the water where you're, if you are a bit of an oblique angle to a tree and your line snags around a tree or a branch, you continue to arc on that tree branch effectively. So you end up doing a even smaller sort of fan search and coming back on yourself until you find your own line. And you may not realise that, but it's down for the attendant to be switched on the surface to actually realise what's happening, and either communicate it via the comms if they're working, or ultimately give you a pull on the line and get you to come to the surface and say, look, you've got a snag, and you have to go back down and clear it. Well, from then on, that just started happening all the time, and it turned into a nightmare dive, to be honest with you. Really, really difficult, so many snags, and of course, don't forget, you have to search all these areas. Now, we didn't know when these trees had been cut. Clearly, they hadn't been cut, like within the last few days, but we didn't know, had his body slipped down underneath them, so I was having to really get down inside all the branches and the roots and the tree trunks, and search underneath them, all the little gaps created because trees and their branches aren't, perfectly straight. There's lots of lumps and bumps in them, so it creates all sorts of voids, that he could have gone into. That, what the last thing I want to do was come up and say, no, he's not there, and then somebody else find him. Professionally, it'd be very embarrassing. So it took ages to search, and I was forever getting snagged. It was a really difficult search, and very, very tiring as well, because an arc search, as we've already talked about, you're constantly swimming against that line that has to be kept tight for the search to be accurate. So normally, an arc search would be limited to maybe 45 minutes at tops, and even in the winter, you're never going to get cold because you're working so hard, you heat up. But on this occasion, it was the height of summer, it was very warm, and the water temperature was reasonably warm, so I was already, hot before I got in. and I just didn't cool down. So it was very, very hot and unpleasant, and quite frankly exhausting. You know, I was relatively fit then, certainly not the fittest on the team, but you know, a reasonable level of fitness. We had very strict annual medicals, so we had to keep up levels of fitness. We were in the gym most days doing something. So yeah, reasonably fit, but yeah, I was absolutely worn out. I was really puffing, and you know, that had been going on for now 55 minutes, and I was almost through, and I knew that they were going to call it very shortly and say we're going to put the second diver in. And that's a bit frustrating because, you know, you've put all that effort in, you want to find it. Quite often the second diver goes in and within 2 minutes he's found the body, and you feel a bit cheated really. You think, well, I put all the donkey work in, you know, and you've come along and found him straight away. So I was keen, but was pretty much losing hope. And then just at the last second, there was a bit of sunlight penetrating because it was such a nice day. And I say there was a bit of visibility, about 3 meters deep. There was a little bit of sunlight coming down through the water. And just when I completed what I was pretty sure was going to be my last sweep, I saw, you know, a glint down on the bottom underneath one of the branches, and in fact underneath some of the sort of bushes that were coming off of the trees, you know, some of the foliage. And it made me go down to have a closer look, and sure enough, it had been his wristwatch. It was the man I was looking for, and it was his wristwatch, and the sun had actually reflected back off of the watch. So I couldn't believe quite the position he got himself into, and you know that he had ended up, you know, under some of the branches and within the foliage. You'd have thought the tree had sort of grown around him almost when he was in there, but clearly I knew that wasn't the case. I thought he was going to be kind of neatly laid across the top of one of the branches, but that just wasn't to be. Yeah, anyway, found him. Now, you remember we talked about body recovery when there's family around, and if we were rural. Now, there was no one about at all. And we were, you know, in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a footpath or anything. He'd sort of wandered off and found this river all by himself in the field. So there was absolutely nobody about. And clearly we weren't going to worry about standby divers and stretchers and covering him and what have you. So I put up on the comms 5 bells, which you remember is the signal for I've had a find. And then I got down and managed to get my arm around his chest and effectively bear hugged him, but he was facing me. And this was one of those classics that when I gave the signal and they started to pull me to the surface, you know, his face was basically touching mine on the way up. And you do have that time to sort of look very closely at the person's face. You know, he had a beard, so I can remember seeing the bristles on his face, and wondering, you know, what was going through his mind. The other thing was he had trousers on. You remember I said there was some clothes. So the only thing he had on was trousers. And when I reached down and felt his legs, I realised why. Because he had cargo pockets in the sides of those trousers, and he'd filled them with rocks to ensure, presumably, that he sunk. And you try and get your head round the mindset. You know, he's at this place where he's decided to take his own life. Yet he's had the thoughts that he's firstly going to leave his clothes neatly in his passport, and now he's filled his, you know, pockets with rocks. And I wondered what did he think when he was going into the water, you know, when he's going under the water and the water is starting to fill his throat and his lungs. You know, we have a mammalian reflex that forces us to the surface at that point, that makes us expel that water and our drive to live. So I wonder, you know, the mindset needed to overcome that and to force yourself to calmly, you know, stay in that position. Because remember, at any time he can surface and think this was a bad idea, but he didn't. You know, he stayed there and, you know, took that water on board enough to kill him, basically. I can't imagine the mindset. I know it's all a bit deep, but I can't imagine the mindset that needed to do that, you know. So a very sad case, but so we recovered him to the side, and I was basically had hold of him, was dragged to the side by the rope, and then my colleagues assisted in pulling him out up the riverbank. And I remember, you know, I took my fins off in the water, and it was a bit of a scrabble up the bank, which was quite steep and of course muddy, so I was kind of slipping and sliding about. I was on my knees, and when I got to the top of the bank there and was able to stand up, I had to take a second. I was absolutely exhausted. I'd been working really hard, finning constantly for, I think it was 55 minutes. And I was worn out, absolutely worn out. So I had to take a second, and then eventually stood up with the help of my colleagues and, was de-kitted, had my mask off. And that sort of first breath of fresh air and cool air is really quite pleasant. And then wandered back to the truck once all the heavy stuff had been taken off me. But yeah, I was absolutely whacked out. I sort of stumbled back onto the truck, and once I was out, I just sat there for a bit, just having a drink, tea of course, and and having, I think it was like an energy bar or something, because yeah, I was absolutely worn out. It was a tough dive, but I was glad that we got him back, and I was glad that I was the one that got him. Like I say, you want to feel like you've achieved something. Yeah, so that was one of our mutual aid call-outs for a missing person. So a couple of other things I want to mention this week, actually, and one of them has come up from one of the people this week that's bought me a coffee, Tilly, thank you. And she mentioned that actually she was in the specials, and I thought, I've never mentioned the specials, and a lot of people won't be aware of what they are, so I will just talk about them briefly, because it's a very good thing. And I don't know if other countries have this, but special constables in the UK are basically volunteer police officers. So they take an oath of affirmation, so they have all the same powers as a normal, police officer. There is no difference at all in terms of the powers that are conferred to them in terms of making arrests and stopping cars and, executing warrants, which is what we call them when you go to do sort of house searches. But they all have, sort of normal full-time or part-time jobs, and can be anything. They could be a banker, could work in a shop, could be a lifeguard, could be a mechanic, anything you like at all. You can put in to be one of these volunteer police officers. So you do exactly the same training. The only difference is, rather than having it sort of compacted into, like a 10, 12, 15 week, sort of intensive training course to go from, zero to hero, if you like, you do it over a series of weekends, well, I'm sure it's different in different places. Certainly the ones I knew did it in a series of weekends where they went off 2 days at a time and did, the training. So obviously it takes a lot longer. It might take them a couple of years to actually, be fully trained. But all the time they're doing that, they're coming out and achieving certain levels and ticking boxes as they sort of deal with incidents and things. But basically, I would regularly be crewed on a weekend, perhaps, when I was in uniform with a special, and they were absolutely brilliant people. So they would be working all week, Monday to Friday or whatever they did. And then on a Friday night, perhaps, they would join you in a car or on the trouble bus, if you like, that's trugging around the town centres looking out for your fights and stuff. They'd have a uniform on. Most members of the public wouldn't be aware. You actually could tell, because invariably on their epaulets it would say that they're a special constable, or there might be something on there that would give you an indication. But to everyone else's purposes, they were a normal police officer. And and they would get stuck in as much as anyone else. Now, all sorts of different people doing that. And you might be very surprised to know that they actually have specials on the Marine unit as well. At Wapping, we had probably half a dozen. Now, I suspect that's probably one of the more sought-after specials positions, because, on your weekend off, you're getting to drive around, a police boat on Blues and Twos down the River Thames at 40 knots. But, again, these people had been there for years, are very highly trained. And it was really useful for us, because these people brought in a wealth of experience, from different backgrounds. Some of them were perhaps in the medical profession, or, professional, could be architects or whoever, or mechanics, and you'd be amazed how many times that their skills, in their sort of day jobs came in useful, and a lot of them then went on to join the police full time. But not always, some were very happy doing years and years of service, just doing, kind of a couple of days a month or whatever it was, so a really good system, the special constables in the UK. And I don't know, maybe you could leave a comment perhaps on the YouTube. Does the US do this? Do other countries have, sort of volunteer police officers? There's no pay involved. They get expenses if they have to travel, and I think they get some allowances, but there's no actual pay involved. They're doing it just on a volunteer basis, so I take my hat off to them. Really good people, and do some great work out there and greatly assist us. Sometimes You could be really short, on numbers, but you could have, 2 or 3 specials on duty that really helped to sort of crew up cars or make up the numbers in the van, etc. So yeah, Special Constable was very, very good, and thanks for bringing that up, Tilly. That's great. I will just mention another person, Jack, as well, who also bought me some coffees this week, so thank you for that. You probably know that you can go on this Buy Me a Coffee app for Police Stories podcasts, and if you like what you're hearing, you can spend a couple of quid and buy me a coffee if you want to. A couple of things else I'm just going to mention this week, and I don't normally get drawn into this sort of stuff, but it's been a massive news in the UK. Firstly, the Manchester Airport scenario. For those that don't know, basically there was an arrest carried out. It was a fight of some description, an arrest carried out by armed police officers at Manchester Airport this week. And there was some not very good looking footage, to say the least, of one of those cops, kicking a suspect in the head. But immediately during the arrest, that is, immediately when I saw the footage, it was very carefully controlled and released. And of course, you have to put these things in context. They showed absolutely no lead up at all. They just showed that tiny little snapshot. And of course, it created an absolute, furore in this country for cries of police brutality, etc. Now, I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but I wanted to definitely sit back and see the rest of the information and any other footage that was available before I made my own mind up. And sure enough, within about 3 days, and I'm still not saying it's right or condoning it, because I don't know the full story, and no one does really, apart from the officers that were there. And of course, there is an internal investigation to decide, if anyone has done anything wrong or potentially committed criminal offences as well. Because police are not above the law. You can be convicted of an assault, during your work just as easily as somebody else. But certainly there was some more footage came out about 3 days after that showed this particular suspect behaving very badly and attacking officers. He broke the nose of one of the female cops there. They believe he might have broken the jaw of one of the other male cops and had him in a chokehold. And this was an armed cop who was on the point of unconsciousness while carrying a firearm, in an airport scenario. So in certain other countries, particularly the US, I suspect I know what the end result would have been. Like I say, I'm not condoning it, but it was really interesting. And actually, a couple of friends phoned me and just asked what I thought about it. And I said very much that, you've really got to sit back and see the full picture and the whole story before you can make your mind up. And of course, elements of social media and members of the public immediately, assumed they knew what had happened and jumped on the bandwagon. So I thought that was quite an interesting one. And the other terrible event this week in the UK that, again, I would imagine from around the world you may or may not have seen it, but in a place called Southport in this country, there's been a terrible attack where it looks like a young person, I think they're 17, they're saying the person in custody, has walked into a dance studio and started stabbing children, basically. And I think there's 11 children been attacked and a couple of adults, 2 of which have subsequently died of the children. A terrible, terrible events. They're not calling it counter-terrorism at this point. Obviously, there's an investigation ongoing, but it's a terrible scenario. And it involves so many people as well. There's obviously all the heartbreak to come. But I was thinking, and I mentioned to my wife, there's going to be so many people in need of counselling after that, not just the children for what happened to them and what they saw happen to their friends, but parents of those children, the cops that arrived on the scene there, the paramedics. That's so out of the ordinary for the UK. I can't think of another scenario even close to it in the UK. And so terrible scenes and a real need for counselling there for lots of people, I suspect. I don't normally comment on stuff that's in the news or current or controversial, but I just felt the need to on those two. So thanks for listening this week. A little bit different perhaps. Next week we'll be on to something else. Hope you found it interesting, and we'll speak soon. Take it easy. Cheers. Bye.